Hey folks, Matt Eaton here, Scholar Gladiatoria. So here's a topic which HEMA people will probably know only too well, so you probably don't have anything to learn in this video, but I know that obviously vast numbers of people that watch my channel aren't actually actively engaged in HEMA or studying HEMA sources, so this may be new information to you. So those of you who pay attention to my videos will notice that there are various different ways of holding swords, okay? Now, what I'm going to look at here is a little bit of a revelation about Langmessers and Dosacks, okay, from the 15th, 16th century. Now, many of you will have noticed that when I or other people hold medieval swords, we tend to hold it in some form of either hammer grip or handshake grip. Very occasionally, you'll see people with a finger over a quillon, which is a topic for a different video, and led into the development of finger rings on side swords and stay on rapiers and so on. But we're going to ignore that for now, okay? So certainly up until the 14th century, the way that we predominantly see swords gripped is in some form of hammer grip or handshake grip. Now, many of you will know Roland Vorcheka, and Roland's done some really excellent work analysing historical artwork from right the way back into the sort of Carolingian period, migration era, right the way through into the 14th, 15th centuries. Possibly he's gone beyond that actually. And he does, of course, show many, many different ways of gripping the sword. But it should be pointed out that most of these, at least based on my observation, most of these ways of gripping a one-handed sword are minorities. They are the exceptions. They are unusual compared to the normal holding it in a hammer grip, okay? And it's fairly obvious that the majority of weapons throughout the majority of the Middle Ages were simply gripped like this. Now, in contrast, many of you will have noticed, either through my tutorials on my channel or just when I'm handling the swords, that when I'm gripping a saber, this is one of the latest Eastern sabers from Kveton, incidentally. But when I'm holding a saber, I very often have the thumb up. Now, there is some, I'm not going to get, this isn't a saber video, this is a Messer and Dossack video, but there are actually two ways of having the thumb up. There's the so-called Italian grip and the so-called French grip, and maybe we'll look at those in another video. But generally speaking, with the thumb up is a way that we see sabers gripped very, very often, and is sometimes even referred to as the saber grip when applied to things like knives in knife fighting, bowie knives and things like that. Now, the thumb up, why do you do it? Well, let's look at that question a bit more in a minute, but very simplistically, it is, in my view, to enable a greater reach forward with the sword and bring it in line with the forearm, which has some benefits for cutting and some benefits for thrusting, and we'll examine those more in a second. But what I should point out is, whilst I personally tend to hold sabers almost all of the time in a thumb up grip, this is because I'm using a lightsaber. It doesn't make a humming sound and it doesn't burn through solid doors, but it is a relatively light saber. That is an infantry officer's saber. When we get into, not to imply that this is heavy, but when we get into cavalry sabers, very often, which are referred to as heavy sabers, very often they are not held with the thumb up. Not to say that they're not sometimes held with the thumb up, so in giving point they very often are. But if a sword is relatively speaking heavier for you, in the 19th century British sources, not all of them, but most of them, they advise you actually to keep the thumb down. So the general rule is, certainly with British military sabre, it's not the same in all countries, but with British military sabre, the general rule is you have the thumb up if the weapon is light enough that you can easily manage it and manoeuvre it and do what you need to with it all the time with the thumb up. If your hand becomes tired, or if the weapon is heavy in your hand relative to your strength, then you put the thumb down. Additionally, there were people who seem to have had the thumb down most of the time in what we would call a handshake grip, that is kind of canted slightly. They would have the thumb down most of the time by the side of the grip and only put the thumb up on the back when they're thrusting. So there is that variation there. But to summarise, basically most people think of this thumb up thing as a sabre thing. But it's not just a sabre thing, and it has its roots in the medieval period. So Roland has found a couple of examples from medieval art where the thumb is, obviously you have variations of the handshake grip, you've got little grips that are down by the pommel, which he's a big fan of, and very occasionally you do see in medieval art something like an arming sword or other types of straight double-edged sword held with the thumb up the back of the grip. But it's not shown very often, and I have to say, particularly with this sword, which is quite blade heavy, I would not personally want to ever put my thumb up the back of the grip for two reasons. One, because of the weight of the sword relative to my strength, I would feel that it is an insecure grip. With this sword, I feel perfectly secure with a saber with the thumb up, with a lightsaber, and I fight like that on a weekly or twice a weekly basis with the thumb up like 95% of the time. No problem at all. When I switch to a heavier arming sword or a falchion or something, or any heavier weapon like a mace or an axe, I'm not going to put my thumb up the back because I can't manage the weight of the weapon, and I feel that I might lose the weapon, therefore, by putting the thumb up. So I want to keep a secure grip in a hammer grip or handshake grip and use it like this. Okay. Now, what's interesting though is, as I mentioned, we do very occasionally see a straight arming sword gripped with the thumb up in the medieval period, in medieval art. And we have to just mention a caveat at that point that we can't blindly trust all medieval art, because obviously medieval art was rendered by sometimes monks, sometimes professional artists, not necessarily people who knew anything about sword fighting or combat. So we always have to take medieval art with a degree of pinch of salt. But that being said, some people overstate that point and go, oh, you can't trust medieval art because these reasons. But actually, it's one of the main sources we have for medieval weapons and equipment and fighting. And we know by cross-referencing with things like the treatises, which we work from, that actually a lot of things shown in medieval art are correct. We know that they often show the weapons correctly, they often show the armour correctly, and they often show, you know, fighting guard positions correctly and fencing techniques even sometimes. So we know that we can trust medieval art to a large degree, but we just always have to be slightly cautionary with it, especially with details like this about how the hand is on a grip, because sometimes they get hands the wrong way round and the wrong number of hands and wrong number of fingers and all this kind of stuff. So we have to just have a degree of pinch of salt. Right. So having mentioned that the thumb up is generally speaking something we see a lot with later period swords, spadroons and sabers, and really comes in like big scale, we'd say, in the 18th century when thumb up becomes very common. In the 17th century, less so, more finger rings and thumb rings in the 17th century and 16th centuries. But going back to the medieval period, we don't see the thumb up very often, but we do see it sometimes. Now, there is one particular area of medieval swordsmanship where we see the thumb up a whole hell of a lot more. And that's right, it's these. It's messers and Dosacks. So the Dosack is, what is the Dosack? The Dosack is, I suppose you could say, a proto-saber, cutlass, also perhaps the training weapon for these. You know, various sources show Dosacks made of either wood or leather or combination of both, used in the 16th century as a training weapon. But the Dosack was also, I think sometimes pronounced Tessack, was also a type of basket hilted or complex hilted, basically falchion or messer or hanger. You know, this sabre is a Napoleonic era sabre, but if you gave that to someone in the 16th century in Germany, they'd probably go, oh, it's a Dosacks. Because actually, fundamentally, in their overall size and shape and form, this is quite similar to a Dosacks. So what's interesting is that if we look at these 15th and 16th century sources, first of all, in the 15th century, we see the messer appear. So a lot of people think that the messer is a sort of medieval peasant sword that's been around for a long time, and it's far more complex than that, because actually the langmesser doesn't really start to be common in art until the second half of the 14th century, and really it seems to be mostly a 15th century sword that persisted into the 16th century. So the langmesser actually didn't have a particularly long existence, not in this sort of typical form. But so therefore it is interesting that there are special ways of holding it. And there are some distinctive things about the messer, of course. The fact that it, not always, but very often has an elongated grip, despite the fact that it is a one-handed sword. And the fact that it's got a nail and this kind of stuff. Anyway, If we look at the 15th century sources, very often, not always, very often they're just gripped like this, but very often we do see them with the thumb up. And obviously, because you've got a long grip, you can move the hand up or down on the grip and do various other things. Famously, of course, the thumb is used on the flat of the blade for doing certain techniques like the Twerchow and just winding into people's swords. So that is a very Germanic thing to do. We see it very much in the German fencing treatises. We don't really see it in the Italian ones. So there is that grip, of course. So it's a very versatile grip. You can do lots of different things with, and you've got that characteristic nagel to stop the opponent's blade sliding up your blade there. But I find it fascinating that in a way, you could say that this is the earliest definite ancestor of the sabre of later centuries. So we basically kind of go Langmesser, Dosacks, and then we get into cutlasses and sabers. And I do find it interesting that right from the beginning in the 15th century, we already start to see this thumb up. As for why, so I said I'd say a little bit more about it. Well, this isn't a video purely about technique, obviously. It's more about just the fact that I find it fascinating that Dosacks and Messers have this thumb up grip that we later see persisting into sabers. Why did they do this? Well, I think there are a couple of reasons. I think one is because it gives you better point control. It brings much like having a finger over a finger ring, it brings the blade in line with the forearm. Okay, potentially also it means you can get quicker snap cuts that might not be these full-bodied, kind of as we call them in Italian fencing, we call them a full blow, okay, but more like a mezzocolpi, so a half blow. So if we're doing these mezzocolpi that extend out and finish in the middle with the point towards the opponent, or as Anonimo Bolognese would call this would be gioco largo. So if we're doing gioco stretto, if we're doing gioco stretto rather than gioco largo, so instead of following all the way through to a low guard, if we're coming out down here to occupy the centre line with the blade, then having the thumb up enables you to do that. It enables you to have the weapon out here, whereas if we were following through, then perhaps a hammer grip makes more sense in that situation. And there are specific techniques that it potentially assists as well, like the Scheitelhau, maybe the Schielhau, I don't know, there's different interpretations of that, and I'm not an expert on the German lineages. But certainly if you want to lift the hilt up and strike high and over someone's sword guard, hitting them on the top of the head, or arm potentially, then this is assisted as well, because a hammer grip, you have a different angle of the blade in the grip. By putting the thumb in, you can now reach a bit further and come over a person's guard or sword. So there we go. I think there's various advantages. There's obviously some disadvantages. As I mentioned, if you've got a sword that you find difficult to manage, then this is undeniably a weaker grip with the thumb up. But it's very clear that with these relatively light and nimble weapons used in unarmoured situations, with the Messer and the Dosacks, we already in the 15th century, it's quite incredible when you think about it, we already in the 15th century start to see a grip which persisted right the way through to the 20th century with sabers, and is still the predominant grip used today in military and Olympic sports sabre fencing as well. And it had its root at least in the 15th century, if not earlier, with the ancestors, I see it as that, see them as that anyway, the ancestors of those military sabres. Anyway, cheers for watching, give us a like and a subscribe, and I will see you, if I don't see you for extra videos on Patreon, which just a reminder that I've got extra videos on there, I'll see you for another video on the public channel real soon. Cheers for watching, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.